Welcome to the Republican Professor. This morning we have with us a very special guest, one of my favorite people in local politics in Orange County, Kevin Muldoon. Thanks for being here, Kevin.
Hey, look, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to call you the professor during this segment. But just so we're clear, I don't think anyone calls you that off the air.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Kevin is the mayor of Newport Beach. Is that correct?
Yes.
I always like to get my facts straight. Yeah, well, welcome, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Appreciate it. And we've got a much better backdrop than I do. I just grabbed a pretty standard conference room.
Yeah.
I see. Are you calling from San Francisco, or are you down here?
Well, I'm homeless and they don't kick me out of this park. This is the Marin Headlands. For those of you listening for those of you listening on Apple Podcasts and can't see it, I have the Marin Headlands in the background, and our guest Kevin has a conference room background. So that's because Kevin is working and I'm homeless up here in the Marin Headlands with the Golden Gate Bridge behind me. And since I'm homeless, the people in San Francisco, they just leave me alone. And that's until they find out I'm a Republican, and then they want to kick me out. And then they're like, Yeah. So Kevin has had quite a few years in local politics here in Southern California and Orange County. He was elected to the City Council of Newport Beach, I think in 2014. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So it's been, almost a decade, going on a decade. And before that, you had some experience working elsewhere. You want to tell us about that? Or do you want to start with your story?
Yeah, well, I know we're both Orange County guys. I grew up in Orange County, grew up in Lake Forest. And I kind of went to law school because I loved politics and knew I could still use a law degree in business. And when I got out of law school, I interned the White House. I think that's what you were alluding to. We were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So that was a great experience. That was for President George W. Bush. And I worked in what's called the Executive Office Building. That's the big office building right next to the White House where most staff work. The East Wing is for the First Lady, and the West Wing is actually relatively small, and there's a large building right next to it called the Executive Office Building. And you take the Navy steps across West Exec Avenue, and it takes you up to Vice President's office, Indian Treaty Room, and most offices are staff. So I was in that building, and it was an amazing experience. And that was in 2006 during the midterm. So I also saw that's when the Republicans lost the House and Senate. And there was a lot of blaming of the Iraq War, and Rumsfeld left after that loss. I think Republicans were spending too much, and the voters, rather than being energized like they were by Reagan, they were a little fatigued by looking like a Democrat Party-like at times. So I saw that loss that was experienced, which typically is experienced in a president who is in a war in the second term, midterm, which is what historically does happen. But I personally think that if you are doing amazing things and you're really reducing the debt and cutting spending, you're going to energize your base, and you're not going to have that base fatigue that we experienced. So that was a great experience, and came back and was sworn in as an attorney. Practiced law as a prosecutor here in Orange County again. Great experience, toughest job I've ever had. Really, really tough. I can imagine how tough it must be for prosecutors under Gascon, because it's just demoralizing. Them not even going after true criminals for what they should go after them. But even when you are prosecuting criminals, you're trying to get justice after the fact and dealing with some attorneys who sometimes will lie.
You just referenced Gascon. I just want to make a little note in here for people far in the future. That's the LA County District Attorney that's serving right now.
That's right. LA County, hopefully he gets recalled. I was under Tony Rakakis here in Orange County, a good prosecutor who went after criminals to the fullest extent. And luckily, Todd Spitzer just won re-election against some opponents, and he's also a good prosecutor here in Orange County, goes after criminals for the fullest extent. And
I voted for him.
Oh, as did I. And even with the office support and the head prosecutor support, there's a lot of tough stuff you've got to see and witness and police reports and witness testimony. And it was a very difficult job, but a great training experience for politics.
Wow. Well, man, you look so young, and it's like we barely got out of into the Obama administration, and you got experience in the White House as a prosecutor. How did you go from the leap from prosecutor to city council? And I think but maybe it's probably good to also mention for folks that don't know what a city council member does.
Mhm.
And is it full-time? Is it part-time? Yeah, a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a part-time position here in Newport Beach. And I was private sector for a lot of years after being a prosecutor, and worked for businesses as general counsel, and now don't practice much law at all. And I was living in Newport. In Newport, you have to live in a specific district, meaning a part of the city, in order to represent that district. And a couple of businessmen and activists approached me, and they wanted me to run for city council. It's a citywide race, but again, you got to live in a certain district. And then they couldn't find anyone else in the district. So slim pickings. I thought I never wanted to be in local government. I said, no, thank you. I do really enjoy politics. I enjoyed my time in Washington, and I enjoy the federal issues, but I have no interest in serving on a local government board. But they persisted, and I agreed because I thought I had the time, and I thought that there are some good issues that we were running on. So I got elected in 2014. Like I said, it's a part-time position. It's a part-time council. They pay you a small stipend, and that easily takes 10 to 20 hours on an off week and 20 hours plus on a city council week where you meet. So it's a demanding part-time position. Well, yeah, I've done that for almost 8 years now. And 2 of those 8 years I've been mayor. And I'm mayor currently, and our colleagues on council, there are 7 of us. We select the 7 among us. So I was honored to be selected for this year. And this is my final year. I'm turned off of city council this year. And I'll go back to the private sector and keep enjoying the excitement of business. I enjoy business.
Hmm. Can you give us a sense of what that stipend is? We're just curious. Those
Yeah.
kind of details are interesting to us.
Yeah, it's about $1,000 a month. Yeah, you're a W-2 employee. It's $1,000 a month salary. But it is technically a job, and council members have tried to fight the IRS or the state on whether or not it's employment, and the courts have ruled it is employment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So it's like a part-time, it's really part-time, like grocery store wage job, basically.
Yeah. You don't do it for the money.
You don't do it for the money. Okay, I'll put that's going to be the title of
Yeah.
this episode. You don't do it for the money.
Yeah.
Well, some people listening in the future will probably think that, well, they might not know anything about local politics. I think a lot of people don't. And they maybe follow national politics a little bit. Like they maybe know the major players a little bit. Most people have no idea how big the government is. No concept how big the government in Washington is, let alone the state. I think the local politics is just the most they know is they drive through the neighborhood from the grocery store to the gas station, and they see yard signs, and maybe they know a name because they see yard signs, but that's about probably all they know. So you've already given them way more than they knew before. There's a 7-member council. And then you guys choose. Did you vote for yourself to be mayor?
Shamelessly, yes, I did.
Okay, so it's something you wanted to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a real honor, and it was the first time was unanimous. Second time, I think there's one person dissenting, but for the most part, it's a consensus position.
Yeah.
And the tradition has been to rotate once a year, but the charter actually says you serve 2 years or at the pleasure of your colleagues. And it's become a one-year tradition, and it's not adversarial. It's very friendly. You might not have the ability to serve 1 year as mayor because big time commitment, so other people are approached. And it really creates a cohesive council. It's the most common form of local government here in California. Most cities have a rotating mayor versus what's called a direct elect mayor. And then even among the direct elect mayors, they're often not full-time positions. The full-time position mayors you might think of would be like Los Angeles, San Francisco. Well, they have board of supervisors. San Diego, Fresno, some of the larger cities, they're the ones that have a full-time mayor who acts almost more like an executive than a legislative body.
Okay. All right. So the mayor in those bigger areas is he a member of the city council?
Yeah, they still be considered a member, elected member of the city council, and they might have more votes than their colleagues, and they might have the power, the veto power. But they truly are an executive form of government, whereas we oversee a city manager, almost like corporation. He or she will be like a CEO, and the mayor is like the chairman of the board, and the other council members are board members.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
That's very
But
standard.
you still get like the Secret Service detail protection.
Yeah. There used to be about 50 years ago in Newport Beach, we called our mayor the president, and the other council members were the trustees, maybe longer than 50 years ago. And I used to joke that to be the president of Newport Beach, you would have an old 80s limousine with some third world country flags waving on the front and a detail. So I'm sure at some point, yes, in Newport Beach, they had some sort of special presidential treatment, but not today. With transparency and the press, there really are no special favors. People joke all the time. Can you get me out of a parking ticket? The answer is no. I could not get you out of a parking ticket.
That's hilarious. Wow, that's funny. Kevin, what does the mayor do then? I mean, why would you want to be mayor? I'm asking because I remember getting my first professor job. It was teaching symbolic logic. I was so honored to get the job. I didn't have any teaching experience of my own. I was a TA, but I didn't. It was the first time I was going to teach the class with my name on the syllabus. Well, later I found out I probably got the job because nobody else wanted to teach that job. And so for years, I was like, I thought I was like all awesome, but it just turned out like I was like the schmuck. And so I don't think that's the case with the mayor, but I was just kind of pushing into like, obviously if you voted for yourself, you wanted the job and other people, but is there something about the job that makes it more difficult to be on the city council? Is it a harder job? You don't get paid more, right?
Yeah. There's certainly. Well, first, I would like to say that when I said no one calls you professor outside of this podcast, I meant socially where I know you. I did not mean professionally. So symbolic logic. I took that in undergrad. That's a very tough class to learn, I imagine, to teach. And
the first couple of times teaching it was I was working really hard, put it that way.
Sure.
And then after a while, you get used to it.
Yeah. So I will try to answer it with symbolic logic. It is not necessarily the case, but likely the case that you want to be mayor yourself.
Okay. Gotcha.
And it's a huge honor. It's a huge honor. It's not just being someone who has a pulse and it is available. Pretty much everyone on council wants to be mayor at least once during their tenure, perhaps twice. And I've never heard of anyone turning it down. I'm sure it's happened, but I haven't heard of it happening. It's a larger time commitment. You have to attend more ceremonies, and you speak on behalf of the city, if you will. So when you hand a proclamation for a special event, it's signed by the mayor, not the rest of the members of council, and it's written in the mayor's voice. So there's a ceremonial component to being mayor. And then there's a procedural component to being mayor. When you're on the dais, you essentially, you run the meetings. You don't have much more say over the agenda. At Newport Beach, we have a custom where the mayor is not a very strong mayor, and that they don't decide what does and does not go on the agenda. but you do run the meeting. Sometimes you make the decision on what rules are followed during the meetings. We loosely follow Robert's rules, but you still have one vote. So you're pretty similar to your colleagues, except for the ceremony component, and you get a slight increase in that stipend I mentioned. You make, I think, about $100 more a month, so it pays a little better too. Which again, we're not in it for the money, but
So it's not like you were like, let me think about it, and they said that it's $100 more a month, and you're like, I'm in.
That's right.
I'm in.
Yeah,
That's a couple of padrones right there. I'm in.
Yeah, we we don't even get it. We do get an office. The mayor does have a special office, which I never use. We don't get a parking spot. They're really the perks are in the intangible.
Why don't you use the office? Does it suck?
No, it's nice. I'll tell you, first off, it's not as nice as the city manager's office. City manager has an ocean view, which tells you where the power really lies.
City manager.
It lies in the bureaucracy and the staff who can stay there for decades and can wait out council members and can work to undermine council members on a regular basis. That's just the reality of working in local government. No, it's a nice office, but I've got a day job, and today modern technology, you could just do a Zoom or call in. If someone were wanting to meet with me on a formal issue, I might have them meet me in the mayor's office, but really I'd probably prefer a conference room at City Hall. So there just isn't a lot of a use for it. But I will tell you, it's interesting in Newport. We don't have offices for the other council members. I think it's kind of odd. Every other city I've seen, every council member has an office. In Newport, only the mayor has an office, and quite frankly, everyone can use it. So again, it's not about the perks. We're not motivated by that in Newport Beach. We don't even have a lot of the perks the other cities do. I'm in it because I'm a true believer in limited government, individual freedoms.
That makes sense. I think if those perks were a little bit more, well, if you mentioned everybody can use the office, if that wasn't the case, it might be that the vote was slightly different. I don't know, but it seems like it's a non-adversarial place to work, and you don't seem, to me, when I talk to you, you don't seem like an annoyingly ambitious person. Like, there's in politics, when you're in politics for a while, you're around politics people. It can be this way in certain scholarly groups as well, that there are people that are ambitious in the worst sense of the term. And what I mean by that is, it's hard to explain if you haven't seen it for yourself, but it's maybe you and maybe other people have seen it and they just can't recognize what it is. But it's kind of a short-sightedness, I would say. You might be having a conversation with somebody at an event, like a cocktail thing, and then they're constantly looking around to see who else is showing up, but to see, it's all about appearances and it's not about substance.
Yeah.
I've discovered you're not that way at all. You're about, to me, I don't know you extremely well, but it seems like you have quite a bit of substance actually there. And I got the sense that you were in politics for not like these annoyingly ambitious, short-sighted thing, but you actually are a true believer.
Yeah.
In other words, when you say I'm just responding to your comment about you believe in limited government. Can you expand on that, what that means for you?
Yeah, well, first, nice stuff for you to say, Lucas. I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, I believe that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as the saying goes. And that the best kind of government is small and limited. It's answers to the people. And when you have that type of government that is too small to control your lives, they're less likely to turn their guns on the people, like we see, unfortunately, in so many communist and socialist regimes. We see the eventual shutting down of all dissenting voices, and then eventually extreme measure of annihilating its own citizens. And that is a constant trend we've seen throughout history, and is naive to think that trend is somehow going to stop. Government is never something that you should fully trust. And history has told us time and time again that too much power, too much centralized power, is a threat to not only basic liberties you and I enjoy, but life. So that's really what motivates me. When I was younger, I was had more of a libertarian bent, if you will. I wasn't as socially conservative, and then I kind of grew out of that. And I still have a libertarian bent, but I'm much more socially conservative. And at the end of the day, I think so many of us can disagree on some of those social issues, but we can agree that the biggest threat to all of our freedoms and to our life is a big government. Mm-hmm. So that's where I come from a business standpoint and economic standpoint. It's also inefficient, and it destroys production and individual ambition and motivation to create new products and successful businesses. So it not only is it a threat to our freedom and liberty and life, but it's also a destroyer of prosperous civilization. So I'm basically, that's really what motivates me. But I'm just, I'm also a Christian. I just sort of believe in doing what God puts in front of me. I think at the end of the day, He's in charge, and I get a lot of peace from knowing that certain people or certain movements that I view as really evil are not just going to get away with it scot-free, and they might in this life, but there are consequences for our actions in the next life as well. And that gives me a lot of peace, because otherwise it could be really disheartening to see what people will do to other people.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of a threat to business that government poses when you have?
Yeah.
I mean, business is important for us, especially the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
We saw the shutdowns happen, and I was pretty disturbed by how callous and cavalier some people that don't even run for election were about government's power to crush a small business.
Yeah.
And I was deeply disturbed by some of the rhetoric that I saw from people that would be customers of those businesses.
Mm-hmm.
After the businesses disappeared, there was surprise.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just such a lack of attention span.
Very short.
There's further consequences too, because businesses pay taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Payroll tax is the biggest one. Sales tax.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the kind of taxes. Of course, income tax. The people that work there pay income tax, and that can be a huge. There's property taxes. If the businesses aren't there to pay those taxes into the government as revenue, and all levels of government, then the so-called generous services, and I hate that word generous because I don't think it applies to business at all. I'm sorry. I don't think it applies to government. It might apply to business. It depends on the structure of the business, but the government is not generous. The government has no compassion whatsoever. They might spend a lot on some program, but that doesn't mean it's generosity.
Yeah.
Generosity is a very specific thing. But how do you get the money into the government coffers if people are getting laid off and they're not paying taxes on their income? They're not getting
Mhm.
payroll tax.
Mhm.
They're not, and then if the business goes out of business, then who's paying property tax on? Well, it might be the person that owns the business building, but then if they don't have tenants, how are they going to pay the tax? Anyway, can you talk about your concern about the threat to business? I just gave one example
Yeah.
of just extreme fear
Mhm.
mongering on public health, but there's other examples, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, Milton Friedman said that all freedoms come from economic freedoms, and there's some truth to it. Clearly, God had a natural order in store that involved harvesting, reaping what you sow, and we know through civilizations that ability to have a middle class or empowered people below the king, like the Magna Carta, allows you to enjoy freedoms, and with that economic independence, you're less reliant on a centralized power. So, but I think people either don't have the education or the background, that very niche subject about. I'm a history major. I love history, but if you don't have a real passion for that, you might not understand how important it is to have small businesses. And, you know, in fact, even Elon Musk is good, although we can't relate to someone who has that much wealth. And Elon Musk can stand up to a really strong authority, and then numerous people of that economic position can stand up to a president or a king, which is the concept that we inherited via the Magna Carta from England. That is not just one authority. So when you have fractured power and decentralized power and individuals who can stand up for themselves and for others, you have checks and balances, if you will. And economics, I would argue, is, like Milton Friedman said, is basically the foundation, and that foundation brings us all these liberties. So I believe if someone is saying, shut down that business, never mind that the mayor might be ignoring the lockdown rules themselves, but we're going to shut down this specific business. Case of Los Angeles, we're going to shut off their power and water and do really dictatorial moves. Well, I might travel somewhere and disobey my own orders in another state, a free state. I mean, the hypocrisy was unbelievable. But not only do they not understand economic freedoms and where it comes from, but they might have a void in their lives. They might not have faith. They might not have fulfillment. And so I think that some people enjoy seeing power exerted, that fills a void for them. Or maybe they make the state something that's not. The state is not God. The state doesn't love you. You're not made in the image of the state. But some people might make the state their God, like they were required to in the Soviet Union. So whether you are a true believer in this omnipotent state, or whether you just like to see power exert over others, and you don't understand the consequences to your own economic and personal liberties, you might enjoy watching power be exerted over small businesses and over people who want to feed their family. I mean, some people, when they can't provide for the family, they're going to take their own lives. They're going to abuse drugs. They're going to get in physical altercations because they can't take care of a basic human need, which is to provide or to have the requirements you need for shelter and food. So the social consequences of the lockdowns were awful and ignored for some time. And we saw suicides rise, we saw substance abuse, we saw domestic violence, really heart-wrenching, unnecessary. There's that the thing with the Johns Hopkins study showed lockdowns weren't even effective. Totally unnecessary fallout or consequences from little tyrants, governors who wanted to be on the news all the time, mayors who wanted to exert their authority and then couldn't even live up to their own standards. And I think that there was like an elitism too, whether you're dying at the French Laundry for your friend's birthday, or whether you're sneaking out of the state to go to Florida to enjoy their freedoms. There was a real entitlement, and so much the press gave them cover. Social media exposed a lot of this. And social media, I think, actually is another good example of fractured authority or fractured power in a good way. If you just have corporate media telling you what to believe, you're going to hear one message only. If you have sources that can legitimately fact check the mainstream press or provide alternative information, you're going to have decentralized power. You're less likely going to be lied to by the mainstream press because someone's going to prove them wrong with a video that goes viral, or you're going to have to acknowledge a legitimate story that has millions of views. So this is a real highfalutin conversation, and I've taken a couple of detours, but that's what I have
Yeah,
a passion for, if you will.
a lot of my students don't think of the government much at all when, and that comes out in their pro-government bias. The only reason they have the bias is because, well, it's a very low attention span.
Okay.
For example, I taught in business departments for a long time. And when I taught business ethics and public policy, which is senior level class, I would have kids that are just about to graduate. I call them kids, but, and you could tell they'd never even thought about, on any kind of deep way, their liking of Bernie Sanders, for example, and what that really is about. And I would just say, they would talk about the 1%, stuff like that. And I would say,
Bernie is a 1%.
What's that?
Bernie is a 1%er himself.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, what I would say is, when you're talking about adopting a policy that gives more power to the government than it already has, you have to realize that the government is an actor that you have to take consideration of how much property the government owns and how much money is in the government's hands. The government is the 1%. The government is a trillionaire, a multiple trillionaire. So oftentimes they don't even think of the government as an actor at all, or as an owner of property, for example. The government owns 85% of Nevada. Trump owns maybe a block, half a block, something like that. That's just one state, and that's kind of an extreme example because of all the land that the federal government owns there. But the point is made. You mentioned earlier the city manager has the ocean view, and I wanted to go back to that because there's a parallel with the federal government. There's an entrenched bureaucracy.
Yes.
And the bureaucracy is an actor, has power, has interests, and the interests aren't necessarily your interests, that they're their own interests. And this is how organizations work. Organizations like to look out for their own power, their own perks, I guess. And it's the same in Washington, D.C. There's a huge bureaucracy there. But they don't stand for election. They can outlast. I love the way you said it. You said the city manager in Newport Beach, he can outlast any elected official there, or he or she.
And I jokingly call local government, if we have a deep state in Washington, D.C., I locally call local government the shallow state. And it's not as deep as the federal government.
That's good. The shallow state.
Yeah, it's working for its own interests. In Washington, it really is the next level. I mean, there's a social structure built around it. Permanent Washingtonians who could be at the FDA, which is a group, an entity you wouldn't think has much power, but actually does, or CDC. Wow, we can see how much power the CDC has. One of the investigative, if you will, or law enforcement agencies. And They might be from New England, they might be from Washington themselves, but they call Washington, D.C. home, and they're not going anywhere. And they'll outlast numerous presidents. And they go to the same cocktail parties, and they've grown up professionally, if you will, with other individuals who also have power, whether it's the military or civilian sector of government. And they build relationships, and they might not be conspiring. I don't know enough. I was just an intern, but they have relationships from the same country clubs and attending sporting events and Christmas parties. And there is no doubt that the bureaucracy is like any other self-interested entity, or people are self-interested, and they're running these bureaucracies, and they have their own interest in mind. And some can be to undermine the president of the United States, like we saw throughout Trump's presidency, and some can be to be aligned with a president because they share an ideological goal, or because that president perhaps was able to get many people loyal to him or her, maybe she's Secretary of State, within their own departments. And
Yeah.
they can, that's why we have the positions that serve at the pleasure of the president, that the federal departments are not there to undermine the president. They're there actually to be on the same page as the president. And if there's a problem with what the president's doing, there's Senate, Congress, Supreme Court that are meant to check that president. But we're meant to have a unitary government, and we don't. We have bureaucrats who have amazing power, and have their own staff, their own government paid for vehicles. They get invited to speak at these universities, and in the case of Fauci, they might consider themselves to be some sort of celebrity, which is beyond reprehensible in my opinion. It's really it's not what the American public think. And then then there's probably people also who are multi-generational. They've been involved in government for many generations. Maybe their grandpa served with FDR, or their father served with Reagan. Who
Connections are very important.
Yeah. So most, I think, have the best interest of the country in mind, and it's not nefarious, but people should be aware. That the government is not an all loving entity like God.
No,
made up of people, and they have their own.
Yeah. I mean, that's very well said. I love how you said that. As I reflect on my time teaching in business departments, I realized that my job really was a lot of it was to expose my students to what the government is. I mean, a lot of them, they get business. Part of getting the business, I mean, at the undergrad level, they get enough to graduate, I guess. Although I guess we could debate that. But so much of business that you learn in college is regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like no one takes well, when they had me, they would, but because my background was public law and American politics. So I would teach business ethics from that perspective, where you're like, who's this person controlling you? Hold on, the regulatory state. What's that?
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole other entity. And the way we talk about it is so biased. Like people will say, he's a public servant. The word servant is, I think, an abusive term, just like the word generous. That's a generous program. No, it's not generous. And that guy is not a servant. He's an employee. There's a very big difference. To say that Fauci is a servant, what kind of servant do you have that makes 400 and however much $1,000 a year and a huge, I'm not going to say generous pension, I'm going to say huge pension plus healthcare. I mean, what kind of servant are you talking about? This is not the person that cleans your house in Newport Beach. This is not the guy that's mowing your lawn. I don't
Mhm.
know what kind of servant historically meant, but presumably it wouldn't be someone like that.
Yeah.
And
Fauci's a wealthy bureaucrat
why
who.
why would you, why, if you worked for a private firm with the same pay,
Mhm.
probably not as good retirement, because I mean, how do you beat the pension? Of course, you can leave it to your kids, though. I don't think you can leave pensions to your kids, so there's difference there. But you know, we don't call them a servant. And I noticed, like, okay, I'll give you an example. Take public university versus private. Privates pay typically less than public.
Mhm.
But when you teach, you're making more at the public university and you're called a public servant. And
Mhm.
then you're actually making much less at the local Christian college, but you're not a servant anymore.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, it's like, well, wait, hold on a second. I'm teaching the next generation of Americans how to think when they're a juror on a
Mhm.
murder trial in Compton, and
Mhm.
can they see the fallacy in either the defense attorney or the prosecutor, as the case may be, so that
Mhm.
an innocent person doesn't go to jail, or a guilty person doesn't go free.
Mhm.
Very important. You know, that's a public thing. But if you're not educating people effectively, well, why are you a servant in, just because your pay comes to government, and you're not a servant if it's, and I would say the case is the same in business. I think if you're running a, for example, a local bookstore, my favorite bookstore happens to be Half Off Books in Fullerton. They were shut down. They were totally shut down and shamed for being open. The for part of the last 2 years. Now they opened back up and they made it, but they had to close down before, and I was really upset when they closed down before they finally came back. They crawled back, but it's not easy to run a local bookstore. You know, when your competitor is Amazon, and that government action by those public servants was actually sending business to a private huge company at the
Mhm.
expense of the local bookstore.
Yeah.
Now, why are these local bookstore people, they're not working for the government, they're private. Everything's on the line, everything's risked. Why are they not servants?
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, it's there's part of my deal is I pay attention to language and how it's
Mhm.
used and how it kind of express bias and how it can perpetuate bias.
Yeah, and I've really paid attention to the left. The left doesn't want small businesses that are independent. They really admire fascists, and they want large corporations with social rules in place to select few to be making all the money, and then they want small business owners and, you know, sort of the middle class that democracy relies on to be dependent upon the state. And the bookstore is a perfect example. Uh, you know, these coders and engineers and the tech world that can work from home, um, were were able to keep their salaries. Meanwhile, regular family with a small business may have lost their business, may have had to borrow money, may have had to wonder how they're going to feed their family. We really saw the true colors of a lot of elected officials and a lot of powerful, wealthy bureaucrats like Fauci. We saw their true colors and who they were. And um,
Do you
if you
think
study
that
history, you
do you
shouldn't
think
be.
it'd be a good idea to have the civil service? You mentioned the unitary executive, which I totally believe in, and I would refer to the listeners to the previous episode we did on this with John Yu, where we talked about the unitary executive and accountability, which is what you're going for. You want accountability. The president is accountable to the people,
Yes.
in at least two or three ways, but two of the ways is he, first of all, elected. Secondly, can be impeached. So the
Mm-hmm.
Congress also represents the people.
Mm-hmm.
But but the bureaucracy, the rulemaking state, oftentimes is not accountable unless they get sued, and that costs a lot of money.
Mhm.
And it depends on the kind of judges, right, that are in there, the federal judges.
Mhm.
I read a case that Kavanaugh sat on when he was at the district court in Columbia, not the district court, the circuit court, District of Columbia. And it was reviewing an EPA decision. And I mean, you have to just read it just to believe it. But Kavanaugh was on a 3-judge panel, and he voted um, to squash the regulation or the action by the EPA in this case. I can't remember exactly what it was, but the reasoning is that the EPA had not considered costs and the cost benefit analysis. I was so shocked. I dropped the book, and I actually was reading it in one of those books in Chapman Law Library. I was reading it, and I dropped the book. I could not believe. At the same time, I could believe it because I know my students. I look at it from a professor, and I know my students don't study sometimes, and they have short attention spans. But talk about short attention spans. Now it's in the government, and you have a major regulatory agency like the EPA making a rule that affects an industry that has tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in play, probably more.
Mhm.
I think it was cars. I think it was something about cars.
Mhm.
And they did a cost benefit. They're supposed to do a cost benefit analysis. They didn't do the cost part.
Wow. I mean, what it would cost the private sector,
Yes, the public, and it's like, here's the benefits,
Mhm.
and that's the end of the analysis. Well,
Yeah.
you have to factor in costs,
You sure do.
and that's
reality.
the lockdown stuff. That was perfect example. This is the benefit of shutting down everything. And
Mhm.
okay, what are the costs?
Yeah.
You didn't do the cost part. And if I didn't see it in the Federal Reporter myself with my own eyes, these are college graduates running the EPA.
Mhm.
I probably Ivy League people, and
Mhm.
I could not believe it. I was like, we're screwed because this is already in the government. So you don't need conspiracies.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, it's actually a much simpler
Yeah.
explanation, is just
Yeah.
stupidity.
Yeah, well, it's a culture, it's groupthink, and
But these people had to spend all this money to get attorneys.
yeah,
These
it's really
plaintiffs had to spend all this money. And it took so long. The courts are so slow.
Mhm.
So, what you do is so important, and what you bring to the table, so important. Your vision of the life, of the difference between public and private property is such a basic thing.
Mhm. It sure is. Yeah, the EPA and all those agencies are so powerful, and they're unelected. These agencies, um, the fourth branch are sometimes called. The first being the legislature, where the power resides with the people, Congress and Senate, and then executive being the president, and then the Supreme Court. And then some would argue that these agencies, these sort of faceless, nameless agencies that aren't held accountable to the voters, they should be unitarian, as we mentioned. They should be under the president's purview as the executive, but they have quasi judicial powers as well, and they even legislate, which is unbelievable. They will come up with their own regulations and tell you how to interpret their own regulations. It's not what our founders had in mind, in my opinion, and it's a big problem.
Yeah, where's the separation of powers if a bureaucrat can be a judge,
Yeah,
can be a legislator, and is in the executive branch? That's a huge concern.
sure is.
Can you give us a sense of what it was like to work in the White House? That sounds pretty exciting.
Yeah,
What was that like for you?
it was very exciting. First, I love Washington as a town, the rich history and architecture. And I mean, for example, my great grandfather, not great, I think, served in the Civil War for the North, and he was injured in a battle outside of Washington, D.C. And you can visit Arlington, and I mean, you're just in the heart of American history. when you're in the nation's capital, in La Suburbia, that's not the case. So to get out of suburbia, Orange County, if you will, and to be in Washington was a great experience. And obviously a very interested in politics. So what the Washington Post covers, and what everyone talks about more, the cab drivers talk about politics. It's was really an exciting experience. So the part of living in the city and the cultural part was really exciting. Now the employment component of being an intern for the White House was another layer, and seeing how the White House operates, the Situation Room, how power is delegated, different staff members.
Were you able to go into the Situation Room at some point?
The one that was in the executive office building, yes, they were refurbishing or upgrading the one in the White House, I believe. So they have the soundproof windows, and when the cabinet members come in, they all leave it was Blackberries back then, it wasn't iPhones yet. They all leave their Blackberries outside the room, and there's some Secret Service present. So yeah, just real interesting, really exciting. And then there's history associated with the White House as well that is nonpartisan. It's just interesting, and you learn a lot about the history surrounding the White House.
Yeah.
I mean, too much to. I'm having a hard time even trying to narrow down some of the neat things. It was amazing.
Who was your boss when you were there? Did you have a good
I
boss?
worked for a guy. I worked in an office called Office of Strategic Initiatives, and Karl Rove created that office for President George W. Bush. No president had it prior, and I suspect none will have it after. And it was a very political office, and they would work on messaging and vetting of judicial candidates, and research and polling. It was a real it was a real unique office that was sort of considered to be the think tank, and Pete Wayner was the deputy who was in charge of that office, and he answered to Karl Rove. And then, as we know, Karl Rove experienced a unique and historic relationship with the president. So it was part of what they called a Rove World at the time. Office of Public Affairs and Public Liaison and Strategic Initiatives all followed under what they called Rove World formally. And I did not know the office existed. I applied to a couple offices, and they liked my resume in this particular office. So they pulled and called and interviewed. I still remember when I got the phone call, it was just area code 202. There was no, the other digits were not showing, just 202. And so took the call and interviewed, and they said, well, how soon can you get out here? So it was not your typical experience. I found out later that it was probably the toughest office to get an internship in, and probably have the most unique experience, and really was very fortunate that office asked me to work there for them. I would have been honored to work in any office, though, in the White House. Yeah. To be a White House intern is really an amazing opportunity, and all the friends I made in the program all had great experiences.
Did you ever talk to Karl Rove?
Yeah. Would email him often and talk to him a couple times. Very, very busy.
Yes, I bet.
Yeah. You see, it's so busy. The emails are often sent without please or thank you, and it's not personal. They're not putting Dear John. I mean, it's boom, matter of fact, hustling and bustling, constantly, unless it's for a special event that might be a presidential ceremony or social in nature. And I think that's a little bit of the East Coast culture too, that we don't have out here as much in California. but it is a whirlwind, and it was exhausting, and it was a lot of hours, and I would be drinking Dr. Pepper all the time to stay awake. I got addicted to caffeine. Um,
How
uh,
long was your commute into work? What
you
was
know,
that like?
it wasn't that bad. I don't remember exactly. I think it was like 15 or 20 minutes
You were
along
able to afford to
the
live there?
metro.
How were you able to afford to live there?
Well, I had just taken the bar exam, and I had a bar loan
Okay.
money, and so I continued to live on that as I waited for the bar results. So it worked out pretty well.
Did you ever speak to the president or the vice president?
Yes, a couple times, and again, ceremonial and passing. The president was incredibly personable. Had an amazing memory. I don't know if you ever saw what's that movie they did about him. I loved it. I think they called it W. I thought it was hilarious.
W, yeah.
And where he's being
The guy
hazed.
from Goonies
That's
played
right.
W, yeah.
He's being hazed in the basement of the frat house, and he recites everyone's name. I mean, he is probably a genius when it comes to people's name and personality and remembering them.
Oh.
So he came up and shook my hand, and he knew that he didn't know me, and but he knew that I was among a group of people who all worked for him. So great, very warm individual, but didn't really have a chance to have a substantive conversation with him, because I'm in a room with a bunch of other people who work for him and who are his dear friends and knew him for a really long time. But he still took the time to come over and say hello. And I mustered up what conversation I could at the time. Obviously the President of the United States and that particular president meant a lot to me. And
Have you changed your views about him, or do you still like him?
oh yeah, no, as a human being, I definitely do. I think he's a really caring person. I disagreed a little bit with his policies on spending. He's more like his father and less like Reagan on spending. I'm more of a Reaganite. But yeah, I have very fond feelings for President George W. Bush, and I thought he was an excellent leader post 9/11. And I enjoyed working for him, and I still admire him greatly. And then yes, Dick Cheney
he had a movie made about him too.
That's right. I haven't seen that one. I don't think I've seen that one.
It's not very. It's nothing to remember.
Yeah. Okay. And I had seen him more recently after the White House when he was out here, and he didn't remember me. I wouldn't expect him to. I think I only met him once when I was an intern, but I got to spend some time with him. And he is known for being very loyal and good to the people who have worked for him. And he was incredibly gracious and generous with his time when I had a chance to speak with him in Southern California.
Can you leave us with some advice about to younger people who want to get involved in politics? Maybe they want to get in local politics. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I got a couple of good pieces of advice. One is you can't get your identity from politics. You just can't do it, because often people will, and it goes away, and then what? So you have to get your identity from who you are and from what you believe in, not from a party or a title or a job or a position. I think it's just not healthy, especially in something like politics. It can be all consuming. If as an elected official, if you want to be all consuming, you can be. I have colleagues who look at comments on social media and spend all this time about what the press says about them. I decided I could care less. And for me, that's freedom. And I would highly recommend that. And then for young people in general, I try to tell them it's okay to fail. As a matter of fact, the most inspirational people failed often. They took a risk, a calculated risk, and they failed, and they failed, and they failed, and it happens again and again and again. And that's okay. It's part of life. some people use the feel of failure to not try anything, and therefore not accomplish as much as they could. So I believe it's important just to know who you are, remember who you are, not get caught up in what other people think or say, because they're never going to all like you, especially in politics, where it's almost a 50-50 game. You got two parties. So accept that to be true, and take a risk. And
you're speaking from experience
yeah,
because you just had an election. Do you want to
yeah,
say a little bit about that?
yeah, yeah. I ran
Special
for county
election.
supervisor. Yeah, I ran for county supervisor just recently, and I had a good showing. But there's people who've been in office for a lot longer. One of them has been off for 30 years, and she's got a great name and great reputation, and she beat me. And
What was her name?
her name is Senator Pat Bates, and she will go on to beat the Democrat in the seat. It's a Republican seat in a red wave year, but Pat's well regarded, and she's paid her dues, and I'm the younger gentleman trying to get more involved, and this is part of life. And do I just say, oh well, that one didn't go the way I wanted to? No, you can't. If you really have passion for something, I won't say for public service, because you and I have talked about how you feel about that. But if you have passion for government, or passion for American politics, or anything really, you've got to be willing to suffer some losses. Babe Ruth had the highest number of strikeouts, but he also had the record on home runs. So swing for the fences and swing often.
I love that. What I love about your advice is I can tell, first of all, you've thought about it before, because you came up with that pretty quickly. Yeah. And your advice equally applies to people in business, like entrepreneurs or people in small business. You said, don't let your identity become it. Well, a lot of business owners, their whole identity is their business.
Oh yeah.
And it's okay to fail. Man, it sounds exactly like the kind of good advice I've heard from business people. Don't let it all go to your head, and have a balanced way of looking at it. About the servant thing, just by the way, I think it's okay to use the term if what you mean by that is a heart condition, because it's not that you're a servant just by position. You have if you have a servant heart, you could be a public servant if that's how you approach it. But then you have to equally apply it to the people that have the same heart, even if they get a W-2 from a private corporation or nonprofit corporation, for that matter. That's all I meant by it. Yeah. So I think it's, I love that you have the. Now, are you going to run for election again? Do you have any future plans? Or are you going to just go to business, back into business?
Well,
to be a servant in business?
Yeah. I don't know. We'll see what God puts in front of me. I really view it as that. I have about 6 more months left on city council. It's been a huge honor to be councilman and mayor for Newport Beach. And I don't know what's in store. I do know I need to provide for my family and make a living, and I enjoy business. So I'll definitely be continuing to be a businessman. If I were younger, I wish I would have gone into the military for that experience as well, but that's not really an option. So yeah,
if I asked you if you had any regrets, is that what you would say, or what would you say?
Definitely,
regrets?
Definitely. I wish I would have, after college, gone into the military, and then the GI Bill also would have helped with law school, which would have been nice, and I could have learned more about the military and our history, and served in that capacity, like so many people in my family have. But hindsight, right? It's a lot different. So I didn't see it at the time. So yeah, that's probably the biggest regret I have professionally, is not serving in the military.
Well, Kevin, I know that you, I think I lost track of time here. We got so into this. You have another appointment, right? That you got to get to?
Yeah.
Okay.
I should
All
log
right.
on.
I apologize for keeping you over, but I was having such a good time with you that I just lost track of the clock there. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom, your experience with us.
That was my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Professor. It's great to spend this kind of more formal time with you.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.